Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Dan Humschild. I am the Director of Education at Jewish Museum Milwaukee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this program, this Global Museum Passport, featuring a special opportunity to speak with Dr. Kathleen Lewis of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. For those of you who are joining us today, I want to remind you that at the end of the program, we will have a question and answer session. And you can use the chat feature of Zoom to submit your questions, which we will then offer to Kathleen in a discussion at the end of her presentation. I'm very excited about this program today because it's adding even more vitality and depth to what we're trying to do with Jews in Space, which is still on display through February 5th at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. It's a great opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about some of the research, history, and culture surrounding the space program. In particular, our guest today has an expertise in the Russian side of things. Indeed, Dr. Kathleen Lewis is curator of international space programs and spacesuits at the National Air and Space Museum. She specializes in Soviet and Russian programs. Lewis curates Soviet and Russian components of the space race exhibition at the museum and has an interest in the history of astrobiology, which is just an amazing word, astrobiology, and the history of blacks in aviation and spaceflight. Between 1998 and 2007, she chaired the museum-wide collections committee and has previously served as chief curator for the gallery Dream to Fly. Her current research is on the history of the public and popular culture of the Russian fascination with the idea of human spaceflight throughout the Soviet Union. She's written about the artifacts in the Smithsonian Soviet and Russian collection and has published articles comparing the Soviet and American approaches to exhibiting spaceflight and to talking about the space race during that era. In addition, if I'm not mistaken, she also has a book coming out later this year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathleen Lewis.
Dan, thank you for that kind introduction. And I'll put a plug in for my book. My editor told me I better do that, or she'll start calling me in the morning. I'm going to share my talk, share my screen. There, wonderful. As Dan said, I'm curator of international space programs and spacesuits. And this is one of those nice little intersections of my various and frequently disparate collections and research and coming today. And I'm going to talk about how spacesuits protect astronauts and also how Soviet and Russian suits do the same thing and look very, very different. I'm curator of the spacesuit collection at the Air and Space Museum. It is the world's largest collection of spacesuits. We have just under about 280, give or take a few, spacesuits in our collection, which include examples from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, of course. We have all 12 of the spacesuits that walked on the surface of the moon. And we also have spacesuits that predate the space program, spacesuits that were experimental and experimentally developed for future programs that never happened. We have spacesuits from a little-known manned orbiting laboratory, which was a Department of Defense venture that was never launched. But we also have among our collection early Soviet and Russian suits and components of the International Space Station suit that are in use today. The question has, why do you need a spacesuit? This is something that has been caught on by science fiction writers and filmmakers from very early. But by the same token, you don't really want to believe what everything you see in the movies, because it often is exaggerated or made up of whole cloth just for dramatic effect. They're often highly entertaining, but completely wrong. The scene from Total Recall from 1990 is one example of how it makes things really completely wrong. And in other cases, we have science fiction that is technically accurate, but skimpy on realism. It relies on really fine points of conjecture, things that could happen, like this scene from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but was highly unlikely. Just a second, my dogs have decided to celebrate because I'm home. I apologize. In reality, there have been five major events. There have been a few subsequent minor events that have demonstrated why a spacesuit is very, very necessary. And these have been cases where the spacesuits have failed. Joe Kittinger, who died recently, was not an astronaut, but he was an Air Force a skydiver, parachutist, and during one of his jumps to test the limits of parachuting for the Air Force, had a glove failure. His hand, as a result, swelled up and became painfully unusable. Fortunately, he had no long-term effects of that, but it demonstrates what a spacesuit is supposed to do and how it's protecting you. During the early Apollo program, there was a technician who was testing a spacesuit in a pressure chamber, a hyperbaric chamber, and he lost his connection. Fortunately for him, there were other technicians just outside the door who were able to bring him back out into the open air, and he survived. There's the famous story of Russian cosmonauts who in 1971, after inhabiting the first space station, Salyut 1, returned to Earth, and their spacecraft had a leak. Unfortunately, they were not wearing spacesuits, and they died. There's also the issue, the more recent issue we've had with the International Space Station's EMU, extravehicular mobility unit. There's big spacesuit that Americans and Europeans and members of the ISS use to walk from the American node to do spacewalks, and they've had leaks and problems. So these are the kind of less dramatic, less cinematographic episodes, but they're very real episodes. There are four specific, sorry, don't go back. Four specific challenges that an astronaut faces. There is obviously the absence of air, the vacuum of space, the absence of heat, radiation, or conduction. So once you have heat, it doesn't dissipate because you have no molecules running around and absorbing that energy to take it away from your body. There is unfiltered solar radiation and fast traveling particles. The lack of air is probably the easiest for people to understand. Outside of our atmosphere, there is no air, there are very few molecules. So a spacesuit has to provide air to the astronaut. The absence of heat, radiation, or conduction is a little more complicated to understand. When you think about space, you think of it being very cold, but it's also doesn't allow heat to circulate in the way that we normally expect when we're living in this pressurized environment that here on Earth. It's much like being out in space is being much like being in a thermos, an insulated thermos. The air is not circulating around you, so that heat or cold is not being taken away or any way mediated through normal activity when you have that vacuum seal between your inside reality and outside. And that we first really became acquainted with that issue in 1965 with the first spacewalkers. Alexei Leonov was the first, a Soviet citizen, was the first man to leave the safety of a spacecraft while orbiting the Earth to walk in space. They learned a lot of lessons from this. First of all, the spacesuit was designed for normal conditions, for a pilot under normal conditions, they didn't take into account the fact that his heart rate and his would soar during the exhilaration of what he was doing. That increased the body pressure inside, the body temperature inside his spacesuit, which is essentially a rubber bag. And his spacesuit, as a result, became very stiff. He found it very difficult to get back into his spacecraft, but he sorry, don't know why it's doing backwards. He was able to do so. He didn't follow protocol exactly, and this is part of the lessons learned. He was wearing an air-cooled a spacesuit. Much in the same case, a few years later, Gene Cernan with Gemini 9 was actually sent out of his spacecraft, his Gemini spacecraft, to do meaningful work, to see how a human would operate in space. He too was wearing an air-cooled spacesuit, and that light blue container he has is basically a fan system that plugged into his spacesuit that kept the air circulating. He got outside of his spacecraft. He started to work. Almost immediately, his visor steamed up from that excess energy. He overheated. His heart rate went up to 195, which doesn't seem extremely high, but you've got to consider this is 195 when he is not supporting his body weight as he would be here on Earth, and that's fairly high. There are all sorts of apocryphal stories that have come out of NASA after the flight of how much sweat they poured out of the boots of his spacesuit after he came back. And the only reason he was able to survive this is that his commander, Thomas Stafford, was able to guide him back into his seat. Had he had to do the sort of odyssey that Leonov had done, going down an airlock tunnel, he may not have survived. As a result, in both the Soviet and American cases, they turned to a technology that the British had been working on for their high altitude pilots, which was designing a liquid cooling garment, which is essentially long underwear with a network of tubes, of beverage tubes woven through it, and having water, not necessarily cool water, but a comfortable body temperature water circulating through and taking that body heat away, thus diminishing the sauna effect. I don't know. I hope that they don't still do that. But when I was in high school and college, wrestlers used to use that. They would get into a rubber bag and go into the sauna in order to cut weight. Not a healthy thing to do here on Earth. Certainly not a healthy thing to do up in space. The next challenge of being out in space on your own is the problem of unfiltered solar radiation. We have to accept the fact that most of the solar radiation, about almost 80%, is lost through passing through the atmosphere. That's why it's very bright and sunny, and the solar effects are very high up on Mount Everest, and they're much better, and it's much safer here down close to sea level where I live. The atmosphere does a lot to protect us. And the reflection of solar radiation, if you're out in space, you not having that filtered sunlight, you need something that will protect your eyes as well as the rest of your body. And this is the case of the visor on the lunar visor on the Apollo spacesuits. And these are visors that were at one time gold coated plastic to filter the radiation, the radiation that would damage the eye. They now use a different type of lamination to do pretty much the same thing that gold filter had done. So you have the monomolecular gold-coated polycarbonate, which was used in the Apollo visors. And then finally are those little things that you can barely see. We have errant particles that are orbiting the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour. They are little things. They are things that have come from other planets, from asteroids, from micrometeoroids. They are also pieces of old spacecraft and launch vehicles. This is getting to be a great issue in space exploration and astronomy, what to do with those particles. The Department of Defense, the Space Force does track these particles, but they only track things that are about the size of a softball. And it's those little tiny things that you have to protect an astronaut from that you can't really see and no one is tracking because it's too small. NASA and the Soviet Union came up with ideas on how to protect their astronauts and cosmonauts from these particles. And what they did was to develop a layering system that actually
Someone is at the front door.
Made it possible for small particles to penetrate a spacesuit at one level. When it hit that first layer, it would break up, slow down, lose kinetic energy, go through the next one, and then continue that cycle, thus stopping particles. And to date, the one accident we have never had with a spacesuit out in space is a spacesuit being breached by particles flying around. So going on to just the Russian side, and you'll get why I'm talking about it specifically for this audience. These are the two of the earliest spacesuits. On the left is John Glenn's suit that he wore when he became the first American to orbit the Earth. And on the right is a training suit that Yuri Gagarin wore in preparation for becoming the first human to orbit the Earth. They look very different. But they are serving the same purpose. At that time, there was no plans for either of them to go outside of their spacecraft, but they wore the spacesuits in the event of a systems failure inside the spacecraft. So it had to protect them, though, albeit within the larger safety of a spacecraft, but it would protect them if they needed oxygen, communication, a separate communications system. And in the case of the Russians, in these early missions, they also had to parachute from 20,000 feet because they had not yet designed a spacecraft that could be slowed sufficiently to land with a human inside. So returning to the Soviet and Russian spacesuit design, that goes from 1961 to the present. They've taken a very different course aesthetically, and also just in terms of design and iteration strategy. And largely, this course and really the history of Soviet and Russian spacesuits cannot be told without telling the story of this man. Guy Severin was a Soviet-trained engineer, born in 1926, so spent his whole life in the Soviet Union. And ultimately, he was a designer of pilot systems and pilot safety systems. Immediately when he graduated from Moscow Aviation Institute in 1950, he went on to develop the spacesuits. There is a direct generational link between flight suits in the 1950s that Soviet pilots wore on their spacecraft and the spacesuits even that the cosmonauts wear today. In fact, there's an even greater link because the legacy organization that Severin came to run was actually the first organization to make safety suits for balloonists during the 1930s when the Russians were experimenting with sending balloonists up into high altitude. And so this organization, which has changed names over time, came under the leadership of Guy Severin in the early 1960s. The organization is Zvezda, which means star in Russian, and it's the manufacturer of all flight, spacesuit, and flight equipment for Soviet and Russian cosmonauts and pilots. And it's located just outside of Moscow. It's right there in the center of this map, just sort of southwest of the city, the center of the city. It is a military facility because they do make pilot stuff, equipment, but it also has a public aspect, and they have on display their collection of spacesuits. And this is a shot of their recent redo. I haven't been there since they've redone their space museum, but that gives you an idea of their collection. I will say that ours is bigger, but that's a whole lot of reasons to do with the way NASA orders and has spacesuits delivered, and the difference between the way the USSR and even now Russia today does that. Severin is also interesting and quite significant, and I really haven't gotten to the bottom of this. He is the only Jew that I have known of, and many of my colleagues have researched this before, who has risen to the head of the director of a military production scientific research institute. And that is very significant because in every other case, Jews were limited to deputy director positions, even going to their rocket engineering. Probably most famous was Boris Chertok, who was a deputy for Sergei Korolev, who was the designer of the rocket that took Sputnik, Laika, and Gagarin into space, and who directed the program. But even after Korolev's death, Chertok was not promoted to command, become chief designer of that facility. Someone else, a Russian, a non-Jew, was appointed in that position. So, but that makes Severin's role in the space program very significant. And I know the Jews in Space exhibit that was at the Baltimore Jewish Museum, and I assume that's the one to which you're referring, Dan, featured him as this really important character. And I hope one day there will come a time that I will be able to return to Russia and do further research, because I'm very intrigued about this. Unfortunately, Guy Severin died in 2008 because he was a championship skier, and at age 81, he was downhill skiing and broke both of his legs and died as a consequence of that leg break. So, being 81 and downhill skiing, I'm sure it was very painful in the end, but boy, that really sets a bar for all of us for activity. So when we're talking about spacesuits, I do want to make a distinction between the two types of suits. There are launch and entry suits, which are like the Gagarin and the Glenn suits, are not designed to go out into outer space. They're just a basic rubber bladder. They're used as backup for the spacecraft. And these are in various designs and iterations. The first, you would say, is the design of for the dogs who went into space, from Laika to Belka and Strelka, who were the first dogs who were returned from space. Yuri Gagarin, obviously the orange suit in the middle, but also the subsequent launch and entry suits that the Soviets and Russians have used and still use to this day. They start, as I said, for humans. There's the SK-1, it just means spacesuit, from 1961 to today, which they use, which they refer to as the so-called suit, Falcon. And you will find that there is that trend. All of the spacesuits and high altitude suits tend to be named in Russian after birds of prey. The so-called suits were developed after the loss of those three cosmonauts returning from the Salyut-1 space station. So you have the so-called and the SK-1, which look very different, but are very similar. in interior design and also activity and purpose. And then the other distinction of suits are extravehicular activity suits. And those are the EVA suits that astronauts and cosmonauts use to lead the safety of a spacecraft. They operate as autonomous spacecraft. They are basically human-fitted spacecraft. First used in March 1965, when Leonov left the safety of his Voskhod spacecraft. They have extra layers of insulation against micrometeoroids and radiation. They can be either soft and pressurized, or they can be made out of hardened material. And the current design of the Russian spacesuit is based on a design that Severin and his engineers designed for Zvezda for their the ill-fated Soviet lunar program. And once again, named after birds of prey, there's the Berkut, which was the Leonov suit, Golden Eagle, the Khrushchev, which was their next stage when they had not resolved a way to have two spacecraft docked to one another, and have the astronauts go from one spacecraft to the other on the interior. So the astronauts had to make a spacewalk in order to go from one to another. So they designed this Khrushchev Golden Falcon suit that had a backpack because they couldn't have a tether to one spacecraft if they were transferring one to another. And this is one of the training suits or design suits of the Berkut space suit. This is was on display at the time at the Memorial Museum of Cosmonautics in Moscow. And this is a version of the Khrushchev spacesuit. It has an interesting design that is distinct from what the Americans were doing. Instead of having a backpack that latched onto the back, the suit incorporated the backpack, so the cosmonaut could climb in from the rear and not have to put on a spacesuit and just close it. And there is a small handle the back of which you can see right there under the cosmonaut's arm, which he would use to lock and seal the spacesuit. And this is the Alexei Leonov's training suit as we were had on display at the Air and Space Museum. It's currently off display, but it's coming back in the year 2025, when we will be telling the story of the consequences of living in the space age, which we've all experienced in the last 80 years of history. And one unit will be talking about what it takes to keep a human alive in space. And all of the engineers, the designers, the technicians and physicians, and how many people it takes, and how important that research is as both a career and as an understanding of why space travel is so very, very hard. The other designs that the Soviets came up with, and they came up with mainly iterative modifications in their design. They tried to see what worked. They tried the Yastreb, which was the English name is Hawk, which with a detachable backpack. They wanted to see if that worked. They decided against that. And then they went on back to the original design of that attached backpack single suit, which was the Orlan, which is still in use today. It's a very similar in design to the Khrushchev that I showed you before. It has its limitations. This is the Yastreb on the left and the Orlan on the right. When you design a spacesuit that is easy to get into, you place limitations on the size of the cosmonaut who's going to use it. You don't have very many adjustments and very many variations. So basically, only if you fit the suit, if you're a cosmonaut, will you do a spacewalk. If you don't fit inside the suit, if you're too big, your arms are too short, you won't be doing a spacewalk. So this is an array of the EVA suits that the Russians have had over the years. And some of these are prototypes. Some of them are suits that were in use. These include suits that the Russians in Zvezda initially designed in mind for sharing with the Europeans, for at the time was a proposed European Space Agency suit. And this bottom right-hand image gives you an idea. These are hard suits. They have a metal structure underneath them, which maintains can sustain a higher internal oxygen pressure, which is good for the astronaut, and adds, but it makes a soft suit, which is just a layered rubber with layers, is much lighter and much more flexible when not pressurized. So going back to the so-called suit, as I said, the so-called means Falcon, and they returned to using spacesuits inside spacecraft after the death of the Soyuz 11 crew coming back from Salyut 1. And these were used during the Apollo Soyuz test project. They're very light, very flexible. They weigh about 20 pounds. There are, as far as I know, and these are numbers that date back to the turn of the century, there were about 66 test and training models and 89 flight models. What I learned at the time was that the Russians don't treat a spacesuit as unique. They reuse parts. Whereas during the Apollo, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, the suits were custom fitted for each astronaut. In the case of the Russians, they would take a suit or components of a suit off the shelf, fit it for the cosmonaut for that particular mission, and then when he, or in a couple of cases, only very few cases, she returned to Earth, they would disassemble components and reuse them, either for the next mission for a cosmonaut or use them in testing. The inner bladder they would use to do sustained pressurized testing just to make sure it would continue to work for a long period of time and test out their materials. The original so-called was just a very simple, this is one of the earliest prototypes, never deployed. They used that water cooling system, that liquid cooling garment, and they made about 6 test and training models. And as I said, the so-called suit is, even though it doesn't appear on the surface, is very similar to Yuri Gagarin's suit. It's connected to a ventilation system. It has 2 layers. It has this V zipper opening. And the current one, the so-called KV-2, has been in use since 1980. It's about the same weight. Those 63 testing and training models exhibit, and there have been 220 unique flight models, but as I said, components of them may have been reused over time. And this is Dennis Tito, who was the first space tourist, as he was being prepared for flight, on his flight. The suits themselves, and this is true of all spacesuits, are matched to the spacecraft. They're worn inside a Soyuz spacecraft. They're never not expected to go outside of the spacecraft while the spacecraft is orbiting. This is one from our collection that was worn by American astronaut Norman Thagard. This is an X-ray that we were able to do thanks to our colleagues at the Museum Conservation Institute. And just, it showed that X-ray, what I'm touching here, shows you just how very simple it is. The suit has circulation that reaches all to the toes. It has a temperature and communication system that goes through that allows the astronaut to communicate. It sends up telemetry on the astronaut's physical situation. And, it's a very simple suit. But what I'd like you to pay attention to, and I'll get to in a few minutes, is this lattice system down the bottom, at the bottom of the zippers. And the so-called gloves are very interesting. These are, once again, Norm Thagard's gloves. Very simple system, somewhat copied from the Apollo program, which is another story. And as I was telling Dan, that's my next book, is talking about spacesuit gloves and how very difficult it is to design a spacesuit glove. When the cosmonaut is in the so-called suit for launch and entry, he's positioned in this couch, which is pretty much as close to a fetal position as an adult can get into. And just to show you how it works, the cosmonaut climbs inside this rubber bladder tunnel, which is opened at the center of the suit, and you can see that inside. So he actually has to reach in, sort of like putting on Dr. Denton's, except the opening is in the front instead of the rear. And these are shots from Greg Olson, who was another self-financed space explorer. They really don't like to be called space tourists. And once they're in the suit, they have to tie off this bladder. And there are rubber ties that are attached to the outside of the bladder, and he just wraps it around and ties them off. There are 2 or 3 ties depending on the version. And then he tucks that bladder in and then zips the suit up and laces it right there at the crotch, and you see him lacing it. And then, with the assistance of a technician, he gets into his couch. And this is just a fit check to make sure everything works right. And the couch straps him down. This is done for human survival. The Russians have done excellent research on the optimal position for impact in case anything goes wrong with the parachutes or the soft landing engines. So this places the spine at about 112 degrees to the surface of impact, which is apparently the optimal place is most survivable position the astronauts can be in, the cosmonauts can be in. And that is Greg Olson sitting in his couch for his fit check right prior to his launch. And as I said, there are now 2 spacesuits on board the International Space Station. There is the Spacesuit Assembly External Mobility Unit, which no one ever says fully, except when they're giving talks on spacesuits. It's known as the SSA-EMU. This is the spacesuit that has been in the news recently because it originated with a 1980s design. It's been updated over the decades, but this is basically what NASA has been buying from the combination of ILC Dover and what is now Collins Aerospace, what used to be Hamilton Standard. And this is a suit that they wear when astronauts and anyone else is taking a spacewalk from the American node of the space station. But there's also, on the Russian side, the Orlan MKS, and that is the Russian version of the suit. The differences are very important to individuals who want to do spacewalks. The SSA-EMU is built as a modular spacesuit. Components can be swapped out to change the size and fitting. It was built on the demands from NASA that it be able to fit a woman who is in the 5th percentile of size, and also be able to be modified up to a man who's in the 95th percentile. So that's about a woman who's about 5 feet and a man who's about 6'4". And given their various iteration and ranges, some women have longer arms than torsos. But they can modify any suit to fit. Now, there have been issues over whether or not NASA has had the proper components in place. And this came up a few years ago because there were going to be 2 women doing spacewalks, but they only had one small hard torso unit, that upper body t-shirt, metallic t-shirt shaped a component. They had enough in stock, they had ordered enough, but one was sitting on the shelf at Johnson Space Center, and they had not, somewhere there was a failure in coordination of logistics. And so they didn't have both components where they needed to be. So both astronauts could do that spacewalk. And as I said, in the Russian case, there's very minimal modification. They can put pads under the feet, but basically, if your arm length is not long enough, you can't take a spacewalk in the spacesuit. If your arms are too long, you will feel uncomfortable and cramped. If you're too tall, so you've got this very narrow height and body type and proportions range that limits the Russian spacewalkers. And once again, they're doing very similar things. The SSA EMU is about the same weight when you look at its full equipment, including its life support backpack, as the Orlan MKS. They give approximately the same amount of work time in outer space. The SSA EMU works at a lower pressure and makes it a little easier for the astronaut to move around. The Orlan works at a higher pressure. It works at that higher pressure because the Russians are figuring out ways to operate and take into account the leak rate. There is no such thing as a perfect seal in a spacesuit or anything else. So the Russians compensate for that leak rate by having a higher pressure in the suit. And in conclusion, I always like to give Russian lessons on parts of the spacesuit. So if you're ever in Russia, if it ever so happens that we're ever to return again to go see the Zvezda Museum or the Memorial Museum of Cosmonautics, it's always good to have Russian lessons for this. A spacesuit is a skafander in Russian. It's taken from the French. The helmet is shlem. And the gloves, and which is very important for every child to know, is a perchatka, and perchatki is the plural. And a well-dressed cosmonaut is a хорошо одетый cosmonaut. And that's the plug I promised for my book, coming from University of Florida Press. It is a cultural history of the idea of cosmonauts. And I talk about how, even though the idea of a cosmonaut was originated within the Soviet state, it has taken on new lives in art and culture and even in politics. And cosmonaut is not necessarily what it started out to be in 1961.
Wow. Dr. Kathleen Lewis, thank you so much for sharing those insights and your research as well as your expertise with us. This has been really, really fascinating. And I'm going to actually start with a question about perchatki. Did I say it right? Gloves? Yeah, wonderful. Because you mentioned briefly, and I know that this is some of your future research, that that gloves are particularly difficult to make, and I'm wondering what is so fascinating about gloves, and what is it that makes a space glove, so difficult to create in terms of the considerations around that?
Well, in brief, a glove is difficult because it has to protect the hands fully in that hazardous environment of space, but it also has to allow mobility and a tactile sense. And that has been a struggle, really from, I wouldn't say from the beginning of human spaceflight, but it has been a repeated problem from Apollo. The Apollo gloves have those silicone rubber nibs on the fingertips just to give them that tactile sense. So if they're pushing buttons and operating levers, they have a sense if that's engaged or not. But that was a sacrifice, because that's a sacrifice for puncture hazards and safety. During the construction and the continuing tending of the maintenance of the International Space Station, astronauts have complained that if they're in the shadow of the space station, it gets very, very cold very quickly. And because they are touching that cold, hard space station outer shell, their hands get very cold. So one of the more recent iterations of spacesuit gloves have heating elements inside that the astronauts can turn on and off as needed. So they don't want to get too hot and they don't want to get too cold. NASA sponsors on a regular basis a glove challenge among universities and working on these issues and trying to find solutions to that. They also have commissioned a number of studies on glove impacts. Certain gloves that we use in everyday life enhance our grip strength. Thinking about baseball gloves, that those baseball gloves, just the way they're designed and formed and tended to, can enhance glove strength, grip strength. But gloves that used by metal workers or glass blowers diminish glove strength. There's been work with General Motors at one time in looking at an exterior infrastructure or an exterior machine that will control glove strength and enhance mobility. But the human hand is basically the way we contact our world. So we need to be able to touch the world, have the sensation to do meaningful work. But we also, as I gesticulate all over the place, we also use our human hands to express ourselves. And that's an important thing. And that is an issue that their engineers and technicians are working on, but it's a very, very difficult issue to try to balance between protection and flexibility and articulation. And
That's amazing. I'm thinking as you say that about the the famous painting in the Sistine Chapel of the two hands touching one another, and like the divine meaning that is associated with our hands, but then of course the incredibly utilitarian features that we take for granted every day, but of course in a place like space, not so much. And I'm interested in having a little bit more of your skill set at our disposal here, because you mentioned that the depiction that is often seen in movies about what happens to a person in space are not all that accurate. But I'm wondering what does happen to a person in space if they're not bound by a spacesuit or a spacecraft? What does that look like?
well, it is hard to put it together, and there are physicians and scientists who've discussed this. If you so happen to exit into space without the protection of the spacesuit, I mean, the first thing that is going to have an impact on you is the lack of oxygen. You will lose consciousness within 15 seconds. You may begin to feel, before that, you may begin to feel the gases in your body bubbling through, usually salivary glands and eyes. You sort of feel a carbonated sensation. But once you lose consciousness, you've got about 2 minutes and you're dead. So, that's for a human being, that's really all you need to know.
Yeah.
You won't explode like Arnold Schwarzenegger on in the movies, because your heart has stopped pumping. You know, it's not like Joe Kittinger's hand. His heart was pumping. That's why his hand expanded and distended. Um, but once your heart stops pumping, you know, your fluids are just going to stay stable. The gases will slowly bubble out of your body. You will slowly, as more slowly than most people would think, will lose heat to all of those micrometeoroids and those little tiny particles that are running around in space, but not until they come in contact with you and take the energy away will you lose heat. So you'll be basically, you know, slowly freezing, drying in space. So it's a sort of a desiccation, but it's never as dramatic, you know. And I think, as I said, Kubrick got it technically right with 2001, and you know, using the pressure of the shuttle, the spacecraft to throw Dave into the airlock. Um, but that's required an immense amount of luck, would have required an immense amount of luck, because not only does he get into the airlock, but he's got that 15 seconds in which he has to hit that door and shut the airlock and start the repressurization, or, you know, all would have been for naught.
Sure. Wow. Well, thank you for painting that that picture. That's pretty remarkable. We have a question about the control that astronauts have over their spacesuits. How much do they have over their spacesuits, and is anything automated by, you know, sort of a centralized system or data sets that are created prior to their spacewalk, or is it all controlled entirely by the individual?
The individual has a good deal of control, just because only that individual knows how comfortable he or she is. Um, on the American side, they can control the temperature of the gloves and the hands. They can control the flow of water through their liquid cooling garment to make sure it's at a comfortable temperature, so they can control that. They can't control the pressure inside the suit because that's set, that's what they train for, and any sort of variation could be disastrous. Back in 1965, the Russians did give Leonov control of the pressure inside his spacesuit. And I still haven't gotten to the crux of why they did that. But it was very fortunate, because as his body temperature, his heart rate expanded, his body temperature increased, the suit got stiff, he was able to vent some pressure from inside his spacesuit that allowed him to move more freely to get back into his spacecraft. That said, they decided they were never going to do that again. They were never going to give a cosmonaut that level of autonomy. The most recent one of the Arlon suits gloves that I have seen does not have that heating element. They have used over gloves, just basically mittens that go on top, to retain some of, you know, to have an insulated, just like an oven mitt, to add to the insulation of the gloves when they're outside in space, touching the spacecraft. So they traditionally have less autonomy. It's very similar to, you know, the general lack of autonomy that cosmonauts have as opposed to astronauts in human spaceflight. They really aren't given the latitude to make the decisions that American astronauts would be.
Sure. And what kind of I'm a rock climber, so I know all about tethering for eventual falls. But what kind of tethering does an astronaut or cosmonaut have when they are, you know, outside of the International Space Station? How do they, I mean, I imagine getting back in by like rappelling or something like that, but of course there's no gravity. So do they just sort of pull themselves back in by some rudimentary rope, or how does that work?
There are foot grips and hand grips mounted to the exterior of the space station that allows them to move around from place to place. They are tethered. They have hard tethers um, that that lock them in place so they can't be pushed away, as are all the tools are tethered so they don't go flying away or colliding into the spacecraft. The astronauts also have an emergency sort of gas gun that it would allow them to return if they needed to. I know that we've all seen the photos of Bruce McCandless with his jetpack, and they worked on that for a while, but they decided that the problem with a jetpack is that it really is a single point of failure. If that jetpack fails and you aren't tethered, you can't get back. The Russians have another system which is really bizarre if you get a chance to look at it. It's basically a pole vaulting system, and they have a pole that latches in to one end of the spacecraft, and they're tethered to the far end, and they just propel themselves to the other side and sort of go operating that. But they're also always maintain that tethered contact. That's, it's a low tech, very reliable way to go. You just don't want to make that life ending mistake of just propelling yourself away from the spacecraft and not being able to get back in. And also because they work in pairs, there's always someone out there to help them back. This happened with Luca Pomertano when he had a leak inside his spacesuit. As the water was floating towards his nose and his mouth and his eyes, he was essentially blinded by that, and he had to rely on his colleague to help him get back in the space station, much in the same way that Tom Stafford assisted Gene Cernan to get back into the Gemini 9 spacecraft.
Interesting. I had a question actually from a from a student, which is a little bit crude, but the student had a question, and as a historian of the Russian space program, I feel like you can answer this question. It was about Strelka and Belka, who I know you mentioned, the two dogs that went to space, and they wondered who cleaned up after them. What happened to the poop? That was the question.
Something I never thought of, but just knowing that the Soviet experience and facilities, that was probably left to some technician once they recovered them, most likely a woman. I will tell you that, who cleaned up after them. There was a corps of dedicated vets and veterinary technicians who worked with these animals and still do. They still have animals that they take into space, who do specifically that work. But yes, and that's, but Belka and Strelka came back intact, and for the life of me, I can never remember which one had a litter of puppies afterwards, and one of those puppies was given to Carolyn Kennedy as a present when her father was president by Nikita Khrushchev.
That's right. That's right.
In the archives, there are pictures of that dog. The Pupnik, as her father called it.
Pupnik, that's amazing. I'm interested also in your new book about culture and how the relationship, because of course Jews in space, which we are still showing until February 5th at JMM, and we've contributed certain elements to it. Others have been left behind, but one thing that the exhibit talks about in particular is the kind of cultural relationship in general to space, or to the heavens, to the moon, to the sun, etc. And so the book that you are releasing in August seems particularly pertain to the way that space and our ideas about space and our ideas about space exploration influence and impact our culture. So I'm hoping you might just be able to speak a little bit about what you have seen in your research with regard to Russian culture and its influence by the space race and in general this pursuit of the great beyond.
Well, that's a very deep question, and I don't know if I can do it very quickly. during the golden age of the space program, during the 1960s, also coincided with this revival of atheism, official atheism on the part of Khrushchev, and it was a failed revival. These were people who didn't understand religion, so they didn't know what they were combating, and they went back to old memes from revolutionary times to convince people that, you know, God was not part of that. Though in the meantime, there are theological scholars who were looking at orthodoxy and this notion of cosmism, there to go into space to improve humanity, which is a uniquely orthodox trope. What has not been done, and you know, and it is really fascinating. And I have a colleague who is working on a book on the religion of space, is looking at, you know, were there Jewish theologians who were talking about this at the same time? You know, we tend to assume everyone has the culture of Apollo, and searching for the great beyond is this sort of a tradition of modern American Christianity, but we don't look at non-Christian religions in those terms, though it you know, it's looks to me to be a really potentially fruitful investigation. And I would like to know more. I mean, I've looked at the Russian notion of cosmism, which has grown, you know, as the Soviet Union declined and ultimately broke apart and collapsed. But it has been an independent of that state contact, the state control over religion. But it's also followed that course of a pastoral religion as opposed to official state religion, which is very different. So I would think that there have been other faiths that have examined that. That said, you know, that's it's not my field of expertise, but I am fascinated by this theology of going beyond Earth. You know, how do you justify that? You know, this planet from which, you know, we've evolved, but also, you know, it is part of a larger universe, which is part of creation. So how do you explain that leaving the planet in a theologically satisfactory way?
Mhm. Yeah, it's very interesting, and the work that you do is very fascinating and interesting. And I hope everyone on this call will go out and buy that book when it comes out. You said it's August of this year, is that correct?
This year, that's not good.
Wonderful. Well, I hope people will go find that book when it is released, and that you'll come back and join us again sometime, Dr. Lewis. It's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you did with us today. And thank you to all of you who are in a part of this Global Museum Passport. Before we say adieu, I do want to remind everybody that there are a couple more virtual Global Museum Passports coming up. One of them is about a history of Jews in Ukraine, which helps take you on a guided tour of the 1,000-year history of Jews in Ukraine. And of course, at the forefront of our thoughts will be the struggles of all Ukrainian people who have been suffering greatly from these past few years. In addition, that's on February 1st, coming up at February 1st at noon. And then on March 8th at noon as well, we'll have Jewish depictions that emerge from the work of Pablo Picasso, who was maligned by the Nazis for promoting feeble-mindedness and damaging notions of reality during their attack on modern art, which we will feature in our next exhibit called Degenerate, Hitler's War on Modern Art. And on March 8th at noon, we will get to learn a little bit about Picasso's relationship to Jewish individuals as expressed through his paintings. So I hope you can join us for those programs as well. And once again, please help me in thanking Dr. Kathleen Lewis for sharing her wisdom and wit with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to send them on.
Wonderful. Well, I'm happy that we have an expert such as you willing to answer questions both deep and incredibly profane. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. Have a great day, everybody.
Great day.